At my cousin's wedding, my place card was missing. Her new mother-in-law smirked. "Oh, we assumed you'd be too busy serving." I looked around and found my distant relatives had reserved seats. So I grabbed my gift off the table and said loudly, "Didn't realize a $15,000 check only buys me humiliation. Good thing refunds exist." The room went silent as I walked out until she came running after me in her dress. I, 32M, never thought my cousin's wedding would turn into the most satisfying moment of revenge I've ever experienced. But here we are. The whole mess started 3 months ago when I got the invitation to Sarah's wedding. We weren't particularly close growing up, but family is family, and I'd done well enough in my tech consulting business to be generous when it mattered. The invitation was elegant, expensive-looking, and I figured this was going to be one of those big family affairs where everyone shows up to see and be seen. I should have seen the warning signs earlier. When I called to RSVP, Sarah seemed distracted and kept mentioning how her future mother-in-law was handling most of the planning. She kept saying things like how important it was to make the right impression and how some family members understood the vision better than others. I brushed it off as wedding stress. The gift was something I'd been thinking about for weeks. Sarah had mentioned wanting to start a business after the honeymoon, and I knew money was tight for them. $15,000 felt right. Generous enough to make a real difference, but not so much that it would be awkward. I wrote the check the night before the wedding, feeling good about being able to help family start their new life together. The venue was one of those upscale country clubs that screams old money, even though most of our family definitely wasn't. I arrived in my best suit, gift envelope in hand, ready to celebrate. The first thing I noticed was how perfectly orchestrated everything looked, like something out of a wedding magazine. I made my way to the reception area where cocktail hour was starting. That's when I ran into my Aunt Linda, Sarah's mom, who seemed nervous and kept glancing around like she was looking for someone. She thanked me for coming and mentioned how beautiful everything was, but there was something off about her tone. She seemed almost apologetic, though I couldn't figure out why. The real moment of truth came when they announced that guests should find their seats for dinner. I walked over to the seating chart display, scanning for my name among the elegant calligraphy cards. I checked once, then twice, then started going through every single table systematically. My name wasn't there. I stood there for a moment, thinking maybe there was some mistake. Maybe they'd forgotten to add me to the final list, or maybe my card had fallen off. I started looking around at the actual tables, thinking perhaps they'd placed cards directly at seats instead of having the master list. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. At table 12, I spotted my distant relatives, people I barely knew, cousins of cousins who lived 3 states away and hadn't spoken to our immediate family in years. They were seated comfortably, chatting and laughing, clearly expected and welcomed. I was still processing this when I felt someone approach behind me. I turned to see an older woman in an expensive-looking mother-of-the-bride type dress, perfectly coiffed and wearing the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. This had to be the infamous mother-in-law Sarah had mentioned. She looked me up and down with barely concealed disdain before speaking. She told me that they'd assumed I'd be too busy to actually sit and eat, given that I'd probably be more comfortable helping with serving duties. The way she said it, with that smirk playing at the corners of her mouth, made it crystal clear this wasn't a mistake or miscommunication. The woman continued, explaining how they'd really tried to accommodate everyone, but space was limited and they had to make difficult choices about who really belonged at the family celebration. She suggested that perhaps I could find something useful to do in the kitchen area, since the caterers could always use an extra hand. I felt the blood rush to my face as the full scope of what was happening hit me. This wasn't an oversight. This was deliberate. They decided I wasn't worthy of a seat at my own cousin's wedding, but distant relatives who barely knew the bride were welcome at the family table. I looked around the room again, taking in all the faces I recognized. There was my Uncle Tom, who'd borrowed money from me 2 years ago and never paid it back, sitting prominently at table 3. There was Sarah's college roommate who I'd never met, holding court at table 5. And there were those distant relatives, people who probably couldn't even remember Sarah's middle name, enjoying their prime seating. The mother-in-law was still standing there with that satisfied expression, clearly expecting me to slink away quietly and accept my place as the family embarrassment. She mentioned something about how some people just naturally fit into certain social situations better than others, and how important it was for Sarah's special day to have the right atmosphere. That's when something clicked inside me. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the envelope containing my gift. I held it up so she could see it clearly, making sure my voice was loud enough for nearby guests to hear. I announced that I hadn't realized a $15,000 check only bought humiliation at family events. But fortunately, refunds were always an option. I said it clearly and loudly enough that conversations at nearby tables stopped mid-sentence. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The mother-in-law's smug expression vanished, replaced by a look of shock and panic. Other guests turned to stare, and I could see the recognition dawning on faces throughout the room. $15,000 wasn't pocket change to anyone there, and suddenly my absence from the seating chart looked very different. I tucked the envelope back into my pocket and started walking toward the exit. The room had gone completely silent except for the sound of my footsteps on the polished floor. I could feel every eye in the place following me, and I held my head high as I made my way out. I was almost to the parking lot when I heard the sound of heels clicking rapidly on pavement behind me. I turned to see Sarah running after me, her elaborate wedding dress bunched up in her hands so she wouldn't trip. Her face was flushed and she looked panicked. She called out to me, asking me to wait, to please not leave like this. When she caught up, she was breathing hard and looked like she might cry. She started explaining how everything had gotten so complicated with the planning, how her new mother-in-law had very specific ideas about the guest list and seating arrangements. Sarah told me she'd tried to fight for me to have a proper seat, but there had been so much pressure from her fiancé's family about maintaining certain standards and appearances. She said she'd hoped I would understand and just go along with it for one day, that it didn't mean anything about how the family really felt about me. I listened to her explanation, watching her struggle to justify what had happened. She kept emphasizing how important this day was to her, how much stress she'd been under, how her new in-laws had very particular expectations about their social circle. Then she mentioned the gift. She said she'd heard what I'd announced inside, and she wanted me to know that the money wasn't the important thing. She insisted that having me there mattered more than any gift, even though she admitted she hadn't exactly fought very hard to make sure I had a place at the celebration. I looked at my cousin standing there in her expensive wedding dress, makeup starting to run slightly from the stress, and I realized something important. This wasn't really about the seating chart or even the money. This was about respect, about being valued as a person rather than just a checkbook. I told Sarah that I understood she was in a difficult position, but that didn't excuse treating family like hired help. I explained that the gift had been given out of love and support for her new beginning, but I couldn't support a marriage that started with this kind of treatment of people who cared about her. She begged me to come back inside, promising that they'd find me a seat somewhere, that she'd make it right. But I could see in her eyes that she knew the damage was done. The message had been sent loud and clear about where I stood in the family hierarchy, and a hastily arranged chair at a back table wasn't going to fix that. I wished her well in her marriage and told her I hoped her new family would treat her better than they treated me. Then I got in my car and drove away, leaving her standing in the parking lot in her wedding dress. Update 1. The fallout started almost immediately. By the time I got home, I had 17 missed calls and dozens of text messages. Most were from family members who'd heard about what happened and wanted the full story. A few were angry messages from Sarah's new in-laws, calling me selfish and dramatic for ruining a wedding over a seating arrangement. The most interesting call came from my Uncle Tom. He'd apparently confronted Sarah's mother-in-law after I left, demanding to know what had really happened. When he found out about the serving comment, he'd made quite a scene of his own, pointing out that I was probably the most successful person in our entire extended family. My Aunt Linda called crying, apologizing over and over for not standing up to the other family's demands. She admitted she'd known about the plan to exclude me from proper seating, but had been too intimidated by Sarah's new mother-in-law to fight it. She said she'd felt sick about it all week, but hadn't known how to fix it without causing drama. The most surprising message came from one of those distant relatives I'd seen at table 12. Apparently, after my dramatic exit, someone had filled them in on what had happened. They were mortified to learn they'd been seated while the person who'd given a $15,000 gift had been excluded entirely. Update 2. 3 days after the wedding, Sarah called me directly. She sounded exhausted and defeated. She told me that the aftermath of my departure had basically overshadowed the entire reception. Guests had spent the evening talking about what had happened instead of celebrating, and several family members had left early in protest. More importantly, she'd had a serious conversation with her new husband about his mother's behavior. Apparently, he'd been completely unaware of the plan to exclude me and was furious when he found out. He'd confronted his mother immediately, leading to a massive family argument that continued well into their wedding night. Sarah admitted that she'd been so focused on pleasing her new in-laws that she'd lost sight of what was actually important. She said the $15,000 had never been about the money for her, but seeing how his family treated someone who'd been so generous had opened her eyes to some serious problems. She asked if there was any way to make things right between us. I told her I appreciated the apology, but that actions have consequences. The money wasn't really the issue. It was the principle of being treated with basic respect and dignity. Update 3. 2 weeks later, I received a formal written apology from Sarah's mother-in-law, along with a request to meet for coffee to discuss the situation. I was curious enough to agree, wondering what she could possibly say to justify her behavior. The meeting was awkward from the start. She began by explaining that she'd been trying to protect what she saw as her family's social standing, and that she'd made assumptions about my background and place in the family hierarchy. She claimed she hadn't realized how successful I was or how close Sarah and I actually were. I pointed out that my financial status shouldn't matter when it comes to basic human decency, and that treating anyone like hired help at a family wedding was unacceptable regardless of their bank account. She seemed genuinely surprised by this perspective, which told me everything I needed to know about her character. She offered to reimburse me for any expenses related to attending the wedding and suggested that perhaps we could have a do-over dinner to celebrate the marriage properly. I declined both offers, explaining that some things can't be fixed with money or second chances. The most satisfying part of the whole experience came a month later when I ran into Sarah at a family gathering. She pulled me aside to tell me that standing up for myself that day had actually helped her marriage in the long run. Her husband had been horrified by his mother's behavior and had established much clearer boundaries about how his family would treat Sarah and her relatives going forward. She also mentioned that several other family members had told her they were proud of how I'd handled the situation and that it had sparked important conversations about respect and dignity within the extended family. Looking back, I'm glad I didn't just quietly accept the disrespect and humiliation. Sometimes the most important gift you can give someone is showing them that their actions have consequences, even when it's uncomfortable for everyone involved. The $15,000 stayed in my account, but the lesson about standing up for yourself was worth far more than any wedding gift could ever be.